Good afternoon. Welcome to Linking Quality Transportation and Affordable Housing, a virtual presentation by Link Houston and Rice University's Kinder Institute for Urban Research. My name is Ani Blair, and I serve as the Executive Director of Link Houston. Link Houston is an independent nonprofit organization that advocates for a robust and equitable transportation network so that all people can reach opportunity. We envision a world in which every person in Houston can access work, education, healthy food, healthcare, and their homes, regardless of whether they can or choose to drive a vehicle. The current public health crisis and the subsequent economic downturn significantly impact families and exacerbate inequities in our region. Families unable to pay for a car, as well as individuals unable to drive a car, need safe, affordable transportation options to travel from home to the destinations that remain important to their daily lives. Today, we will be talking to a number of people from the Kinder Institute and Link Houston, and we'll be discussing two terms in particular: affordable housing and affordable transportation. Affordable housing is housing of any type that consumes less than 30% of household income, including utilities. That's less than $1,526 per month for a family of 4 in Houston. We use the term affordable housing broadly. We include all types naturally occurring on the private market, nonprofit provided, government subsidized, as well as owned or rented homes. Affordable transportation means that it consumes less than 15% of household income. Walking, biking, and transit are deeply affordable transportation types for people to use for any purpose. Walking and biking are just as necessary for short trips in connections to public transit as public transit is for longer trips. Today, we are particularly grateful for the support and participation of all of you who've chosen to join in this virtual presentation. We ask that you put your questions in the chat box and that you participate in the polls that we have. We'll take questions at the end. You can also raise your hand to ask a question. So right now, if you'll go to join the Poll Everywhere poll, you can go to www.pollev.com and enter jbrooks762. Or if you're using a phone, you can text jbrooks762 as a text message to the number 22333. Your participation is entirely voluntary and anonymous. This webinar is being recorded. So if you've gone into the pollev.com, you can answer this question: which are you more concerned about in Houston? A, housing quality and affordability, B, transportation quality and affordability, or C, both, can't decide. We'll give you just a second to respond to that poll, and we'll come back to the answers at the end. For folks who are on the phone and not able to see it visually, a majority of people, about 40%, are saying both. Housing equality and affordability, A, transportation quality and affordability, B, and both can't decide, C. Thank you for participating in the poll. We especially are grateful for our sponsors today. The Cohen Foundation funded this research and made it possible for us to join with Rice University on this study of housing and transportation. We'd also like to thank our event sponsors, Civicap Partners, Esperson, and Lovett In-Town Homes, as well as more than 100 people who participated in the Housing and Transportation Task Force. Today, we will go over the study. First, answering the question, why study housing and transportation affordability? Kyle Shelton, Deputy Director of the Kinder Institute, will present that information. We will discuss what we did. Jonathan Brooks, Director of Policy and Planning with Link Houston, and John Park, research fellow at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research, will discuss what we did. Then we'll talk about what we found out, followed by the 5 recommendations to make Houston better. Then we'll open up the conversation to questions and discussion.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Kyle Shelton from the Kinder Institute. I want to thank you all for joining us today. And as Ani mentioned with Link Houston, the Kinder Institute is also very interested in trying to understand some of the region's challenges, understand how Houstonians and residents of the metropolitan region navigate those challenges, and to provide policy and other intervention ideas to help alleviate those. So we're really happy to have you today and sharing this work with you. I want to talk a little bit about why we're looking at these two things together. And as many of you know, and all of us experience, housing and transportation are often the highest costs that many households encounter on their day-to-day basis. And for those of our community who have lower incomes, the 89,000 families living in poverty, the 72,000 families who don't have a vehicle, and as you see here, almost 137,000 folks who are making less than $1,250 a month. Those challenges get compounded because if you are spending a huge amount of your resources in your household on just transportation and housing, you are asset limited, and you have a struggle to pay for all the other costs that a household encounters, whether it's healthcare or education or recreation. And so understanding how these two pieces interact and understanding how we might help reduce those burdens for everyone, but particularly lower income folks, is really critical. Also, as we know, there are lots of people who have limited mobility and limited ability to access cars and drive themselves to destinations that they need to. So in this case, it's particularly older adults who are more often moving away from driving for safety concerns. Those are folks with ambulatory disabilities, and of course, children and adolescents who can't drive themselves. And who are reliant either on our public transit systems, on folks in their household to drive them places, or on the existing infrastructure for biking and walking. And understanding how people access those transportation modes and how they can get to the different opportunities that they're seeking in our region is really critical. And again, in order to understand how to minimize the costs and help people locate their homes and find homes near transit systems and transportation options that connect them to what they need to be connected to succeed in our region is part of the goal here. Obviously, the COVID pandemic and the energy sector bust here in Houston are making this challenge all the more pressing, as the folks who were talking about having low incomes are likely experiencing even greater problems with income, and whether that's a furloughed job or the loss of a job, struggling to balance work and childcare, obviously potentially encountering major health issues. The economic disruption tied with the public health disruption makes these questions that we're asking and the potential solutions that we're pushing towards all the more important, because the more of a burden that we can reduce for folks by either helping them locate homes near transportation and getting closer access to opportunities, or helping identify ways to create more affordable housing, we're helping to close that gap. So with that, I'll hand over to Jonathan Brooks with Link Houston.
Thank you, Kyle. This is Jonathan Brooks. I'm the Director of Policy and Planning with Link Houston. And I'll speak briefly about what we did, and then I'll turn the time over to John Part to share some of our more data-driven findings. And I'd first like to describe the process that we used. The process for the study really kicked off last fall, and it was very inclusive of a large group of organizations and individuals. And it was very much an hour process. And both Link Houston and the Kinder Institute believe very much in community-based research, participatory research, and advocacy. And from the start, we endeavored to do that in this process. We formed a task force and held a series of workshops. The task force included about 43 organizations from both the transportation and housing and related sectors. And in addition, it was complemented by about 10 individuals with residents with their own lived experiences, both in affordable housing and using, people walking, biking, using transit to get everywhere they go. We held a series of workshops. There was really two series of workshops. One focused on what organizations can do that are focused on constructing, managing, and improving affordable housing, and a second series of workshops, closely related but separate, looking at how we speak with individuals and families that are seeking housing or self-sufficiency, and what tools and needs there might be to improve those individuals' knowledge of transportation's impact on their life, and tools to empower them to make better decisions. We complemented that participatory process with what we could with geographic information and geographic information systems to identify where there is affordable housing, where there are affordable rent opportunities, and then converse on the other side of the spectrum, the transportation element, where is there quality for people walking, biking, and using transit, the really deeply affordable and functional network. And when you overlay those, what will we learn, and how can we develop resources and a research report to improve practice? Now I'll turn the time over to John Park.
Thanks, Jonathan. This is John Park with the Kinder Institute. This map shows locations of existing affordable housing dwellings in terms of dwelling count and density by census block group as of October 2019. Affordable housing dwellings are rental market properties that are affordable to low and moderate income households. Some units are affordable because of government subsidy or income restricted programs, and others are naturally occurring affordable housing. These dwellings can be any type of structure, for example, single family units, townhomes, condominiums, or apartments. Houston Local Initiative Support Corporation provided us with affordable housing stock based on the affordable rent threshold using the number of bedrooms, which is 1 bedroom listed under $1,000 and 2 bedrooms listed under $1,300. This data focuses on the city of Houston, which is why the map in the site is limited to the census block groups that substantially intersect the city of Houston city limits. Currently, the city's affordable housing stock is concentrated in neighborhoods outside I-610, especially near Westheimer Road, West Park Tollway, and I-69 in the southwest, or along I-45 in the southeast, and neighborhoods outside Beltway 8 on the northwest side. Next. As a second indicator of housing affordability, we used median gross rent by census block group that is from the 2018 American Community Survey 5-year estimates. Gross rent includes all common monthly housing expenses, such as utilities, and it is also a useful view of true affordability. This map shows where median gross rent is more or less affordable in block groups inside the Harris County portion of the Metro service area. Gross rent is generally most affordable inside Beltway 8, except in Memorial City, Uptown, River Oaks areas, and University Place. Northern parts of the city and most of the eastern and southeastern communities are identified as affordable, which does not necessarily have many affordable housing units as we've seen in the previous slide. However, some of the southwestern neighborhoods indicate low gross rent as well as a large number of affordable housing units. Next. Link Houston and the Kinder Institute created the Quality Affordable Transportation Index, or QATI, to decide where quality affordable transportation currently exists so that we can understand general locations where people can find better conditions for walking, biking, and riding transit. We used the existing data to objectively identify where the quality of walking, biking, and transit is higher relative to all other parts of the city and for block groups in Harris County in Metro's service area. The index combines 7 indicators about sidewalks, bikeways, and transit. Specifically, Walking indicators are miles of sidewalk compared to miles of roadway and non-highway intersections per square mile. Biking indicator is miles of high comfort bikeway compared to miles of roadway. And finally, transit indicators are average presence of seating and shelter at transit stops, average transit frequency on Sunday, average transit frequency on weekdays, and transit stops per square mile. Darker green areas in each map indicate relatively higher supply, quality, or concentration of affordable transportation. Next. So the quality rating of a block group is the average of all these 7 indicators we saw in the previous slide. Individual indicators have the equal weight as each is all important. Higher values mean higher relative quality for making trips affordably without using a car. Yellow areas show locations with affordable transportation that's high in quality. Green areas show medium affordable transportation quality. Purple areas offer little affordable transportation opportunity relatively. Concentrated areas of relatively higher quality affordable transportation exist inside the I-16 loop and radiate outward along certain major street corridors to the southeast, southwest, and in some areas of the northwest reaches of Houston. Affordable transportation appears with lower quality and less availability beyond Beltway 8, except for the southwest. In general, we found most central communities within I-610 indicated high quality. In contrast, as we live farther away from downtown and Houston's job hubs, the quality was lower. And now Jonathan is going to talk about what we found out by connecting the 2 dots between housing and transportation.
Thank you, John. This is Jonathan Brooks again with Link Houston. I'd like to briefly reiterate what John Park just described, in that we set out to complement the work of the task force that was ongoing through the entire project, through workshops and mobile workshops, with geographic analysis. We wanted to see what we could learn, what we would find out when we connected what we could learn about housing and what we could learn about transportation, focused specifically on looking for quality affordability and quality opportunity for low and moderate income households in Houston. So I will describe now what we found. And I will start off by describing a paradigm or a frame of thinking that guided what we found and also emerged through the process. Essentially, we have on the screen, if you can see it, and if not, I'll describe the affordable transportation, the quality of affordable transportation for people walking, biking, and using transit varies from census block to census block group. Every block group has some level of transportation, but there is a relative higher quality in certain areas. And if that is left to right on the graphic, and up and down is the amount of affordable housing, including both the number of affordable dwellings per square mile and block groups with relatively affordable gross rent, then you end up with 4 quadrants in a paradigm. And this is how we organized our findings, and we'll relate them to you today. The first quadrant in the top right is what we would call housed and connected. These are blue areas on the maps I will show in a few minutes. These are ideal areas for families that need quality affordability, because they are the block groups that, through the analysis, demonstrated both relatively higher quality of sidewalks, bikeways, and/or transit, and a supply of affordable housing, either through affordable dwellings or affordable rents, or both. The lower right quadrant is costly but connected. These yellow areas are where transportation is in relatively high supply still, but in this case, the supply of housing is either low and/or rents are expensive and generally beyond the reach of most low and moderate income households. These are areas where there's a need for more affordable housing. and more affordable rents because there is transportation opportunity. Green areas, the top left quadrant, are housed but disconnected. These are areas of the city and the region that could use more affordable transportation, again, for people walking, biking, and using transit, because they do provide either affordable dwellings and or affordable rents. And lastly, the lower right quadrant is costly and disconnected. These are illustrated in pink or red on maps, and these are less ideal areas for families that need deep affordability because they offer neither condition. The supply of affordable housing appears to be low relative to other census block groups, and transportation access through walk, bike, transit is also relatively low. And again, we're not, through this exercise, we are not, as a research team, as organizations, pointing out specific block groups that are as our recommendations. Rather, we're looking for the trends and trying to learn what things might change in our systems so that this affordable housing and transportation paradigm that's on the screen now with all four colors, how we can address recommendations to improve outcomes for individuals and families throughout the city so that they can for themselves make wiser choices on their own behalf. And as organizations working in these two sectors, how we can provide better options for people and work more in concert together. This paradigm is illustrated now. The next two slides, these are two maps. The map on the screen now is a comparison of that affordable housing supply, the affordable dwellings per square mile, the first map that John Park spoke about a minute ago, overlaid with the QATI, the Quality Affordable Transportation Index. Essentially, we took every census block group, that's about 1,800 of them, and that intersect the city of Houston in this case, because that's the limitation of the housing data on this map. And we determined which of four parts of that paradigm each block group should be categorized as. And blue are areas where transportation and dwellings are both present, rents are relatively affordable often. And orange are where transportation still is good, but again, housing is in lower supply or less affordable. And then green are areas that do not have relatively good walk, bike, transit, but they do have affordable housing opportunity. And then of course, pink, red areas present challenges in both aspects. What we found in comparing the supply of affordable housing in terms of dwellings when overlaid with transportation is that there are areas of the city of Houston that provide opportunities for both. Those blue areas are generally located on the east end of what we call the east side and the southeast side, inside the Interstate 610 loop. There are also areas along certain major roadway corridors going to the northwest where there are those conditions. And then there's a large concentration of relatively good conditions in both housing and transportation in the southwest area, the Gulfton, Sharpstown, Bel Air area. Some of those same areas, though, also offer the challenge where transportation is still good, but the number of affordable dwellings and or rents is now not affordable or not in a high supply. Those are areas that are generally concentrated inside 610, the Interstate 610 loop, and in parts of Southeast Houston and Southwest Houston. The green areas where transportation is in low supply, but there's housing, are concentrated in parts of the Southeast along the Gulf Freeway, I-45, but especially on the west side towards Highway 6, FM 1960, and Northwest Harris County, outside Beltway 8. Those areas may present a challenge to improve transportation because of the nature of the built environment, but they do offer affordable housing opportunities. I will now contrast this finding with this map, which is a comparison of median gross rent. Now we're looking only at renter occupied units, and these are rents from 2018 based on the latest census data. Again, overlaid in the same way with quality affordable transportation. And in this case, with these same four categories, we see that the concentrations of areas where both conditions are relatively good, where rents are low, in this case, low is better because rent being low is better, and transportation are high, those blue areas are in the northeast and east and southeast sections of the city inside 610, or along certain roadways to the northwest, and in Gulfton, Sharpstown, Bel Air area in the southwest reaches of the city. Areas that are orange, that rents are almost not affordable, those are located primarily inside 610, west of downtown, in downtown itself, and a few segments of the east side, and then in the Uptown, Galleria area, and out along Westheimer. Again, those are areas where there's transportation, so there's opportunity to perhaps improve housing opportunity. Green areas, areas with low rent that is affordable, but transportation that is relatively low supply or lower quality, those are concentrated, especially in the northern parts of the city, between 610 and Highway 6 after 1960 to the north and to the northeast, as well as some particular areas of the southwest and southeast. We used the information from these two comparisons to craft recommendations that we believe really will move the needle and improve conditions for families and the work of organizations. First off, before we get to the recommendations, I'd like to pose another poll question. And if you have already been able to respond to the poll question is, which part of the paradigm do you feel like you probably live in now? We're curious, this is just kind of a fun question based on your knowledge of where you live in a completely anonymous regard. Which of those 4 quadrants of the paradigm do you think you probably live in? Respond A, if you believe you live in a blue, housed and connected area. B, if you think you might live in a costly but connected yellow area. C, if you believe you live in a housed but disconnected green area. Or D, if you think you might live in a pink, red, costly, and disconnected area. For those who have joined us since we began, welcome. You may respond to the poll in 2 ways. You can text jbrooks762 to the number 22333, and then simply respond A, B, C, or D, or you can join us online at pollev.com, pollev.com / jbrooks762. We'll again give another 30 seconds or so for people to respond to the poll, but for those who are joining us by phone, looks like about 45% of our webinar participants today believe they live in costly but connected areas where rents are a little higher, there's maybe fewer affordable units, but transportation's good. And the other, just over half of our group are split between housed and connected, or housed but disconnected, where transportation may or may not be a challenge. And we'll come back to discuss these questions at the end. But we wanted to make sure everyone was critically thinking about themselves. And I'll not to get too personal, but I'll share that based on the analysis which I was a part of, so I have to answer this factually, I know that I live in a costly and disconnected community in Northwest Harris County, but I make do by using Metro when we're not in a pandemic condition to access work. But it would be a challenge for some of my neighbors to do the same thing. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide now, and we'll talk about the 5 recommendations that will make Houston better, and how 3 of the recommendations are joined with tools to begin to improve practice. But I would very much like to begin by emphasizing that these 5 recommendations do not act independently of each other. They all are aimed at one central goal, and that is to align housing and transportation decision-making, so that whether you're working in housing, transportation, whether you simply live in Houston, or you live somewhere else and you're joining us from outside the region, that you have opportunities to choose a better condition, to find more affordable quality, not just affordability on its own, but quality opportunity in housing, quality opportunity in transportation, so that more people can be economically resilient regardless of conditions and have a higher quality of life. Recommendation 1 is to preserve and build affordable housing in areas with high quality affordable transportation. now. This means building more affordable housing in the blue and orange areas, where transportation is already in some relative higher quality state. That's not to say there are still not opportunities for improvement, because there certainly are, but rather that these are areas where housing that is seeking to be homes for low and moderate families that need affordability, these are the areas that those families can then also have access affordably. Recommendation 2 is the other side of that same coin, to increase opportunities to walk, bike, and use transit near affordable housing. This recommendation, there's a map on the screen that highlights the green areas from both comparison maps, meaning from both comparisons, the comparison based on affordable dwellings, comparison based on gross median rent, where do we see green areas? Areas where there is affordable housing, relatively speaking, but there's relatively lower supply of transportation, and where perhaps do both comparisons have green? And on the screen, on the map, black census block groups are census block groups where both comparisons identified affordable housing opportunities, but low transportation opportunities. And these are specifically block groups. These are concentrated along in certain corridors to the southeast along Gulf Freeway, Interstate 45 and 610 South Loop, along West Park Tollway, and between there and Interstate 69 in the southwest part of the county and city. In the Spring Branch area, in the kind of near northwest, some areas of the northeast, around 610 and 59 north, and then quite a few block groups in the northern reaches of the city of Houston, around Beltway 8 and Beltway 8 up to Farm to Market 1960, centered based on Interstate 45. These are areas where there are opportunities in housing, but transportation in some of these block groups may need to be improved to really maximize the utility of that housing that exists. Recommendation 3 of 5 is to map and monitor affordable housing and affordable transportation to demonstrate and direct the beneficial impacts of policies and investments on affordability for residents. This recommendation is focused on really a realization that the work of this research was really just to get us started as a city and region, as a county. We're all in this together, and that we need an ongoing effort to identify the existing efforts and planned efforts to improve housing, to improve transportation, so they can be done in concert with each other. Because in the end, that's the only way to truly provide more real affordability for families. We, as a research team with the task force's input, but especially from the GIS analysis we did, wanted to jumpstart that kind of effort. And so we created an interactive map tool that on this screen is illustrated, and there's a link to it as well. We will share all of these virtually with every webinar participant by email, but also they're available on both the Link Houston website and the Kinder Institute website. The interactive map, as you zoom in, you get more and more information. And at the lowest zoom level, you have individual bus stops, and you can learn about what we found in the Quality Affordable Transportation Index. You can also then see the housing data. And we hope this is a tool to start the efforts to map and monitor both housing and transportation to improve affordability. Recommendation 4 of 5 is to assess, compare, and prioritize potential affordable housing sites to improve access to affordable transportation. This recommendation is really driving at we can be smarter about how we invest in housing, about how we do very meaningful, but in the grand scale of things, rather small improvements to how we build affordable housing, how we design the sites around the structures. This recommendation is not concerned as much about the quality indoors of the affordable housing structures, whatever type they are, but rather from the door going out to the world. How do residents really effectively, safely, and with dignity walk, bike, and use transit to get to opportunity? And Some housing is developed with certain characteristics for residents in mind, and in those cases especially, there are opportunities. The task force, one of the things the task force we all did was to develop a scorecard, what we're calling the Housing and Transportation Decision Maker Scorecard. There's a print, an online, and there's actually an Excel version by request that's in development and is being fine-tuned. The scorecard is a tool to really help organizations that are selecting housing to be improved, to maintain, or to site new affordable housing, to shortlist and identify a priority for different pieces of land or properties. The second half of the tool is to holistically look at how to improve the housing and make it highly functional and dignified and safe and all those wonderful characteristics that we all would hope to have regardless of what type of housing we find ourselves using. That tool is a way to get us started, and we would look for anyone to be partners in using the tool, and look forward to case studying that in the future. Our final recommendation, recommendation 5, is to develop resources to help people understand how housing and transportation impact overall affordability. And by this, we don't mean in an academic sense. We wanted to, as a task force, put together very practical, individual-focused tools. And the recommendation is broader. In each of these 5 recommendations, we're really describing in the report a broad aim that has great potential benefit, and then, as possible, offering specifics. And for the 3 tools, these may not fit every need, but we do have confidence that with the input of the task force, we're able to put together very interesting, compelling information to help individuals understand and evaluate their own circumstances. In this case, recommendation 5, the counseling tools, there's really 2 companion parts. One, the counselor facilitation guide. This is for counselors themselves, housing counselors, family self-sufficiency. And in its present form, it may even be usable by job counselors and mobility counselors in other contexts. We of course welcome opportunities to create versions that work even better in whatever situation you may find yourself in. That counselor facilitation guide offers a brief course of questions that a counselor could help an individual decide if transportation is something they want to consider more in their housing as they make a housing decision, and what they might do to be able to do that. The individual workbook is what an individual would take away and work through in a non-judgmental, completely self-directed way. How does that person want to improve their situation in terms of transportation as they make a housing change? Do they want to do something different? They want to do the same thing? What do they spend right now on transportation? There's a 4-step process in that workbook that we believe is very functional, practical, and straightforward. These 5 recommendations together, we believe, can help Houston align housing and transportation policy, our investments and decision-making at every level, both public, private sector, and nonprofit sectors. We believe they're all important, but we'd like to hear from you today. Which of these 5 recommendations do you think is most important? And what we have on the screen is another poll. The question is, which is the highest priority recommendation? The answer choices are A, B, C, or D. You can select one. They're in the same order as I described them. Answer A, by text or online, if you believe the most important recommendation is to preserve and build affordable housing in areas with quality transportation. Answer B, if you believe the most important recommendation is to increase opportunities to walk, bike, and use transit near affordable housing. Or respond C, if you think mapping and monitoring is the most important recommendation. D, if you believe prioritizing affordable housing sites to improve access to transportation through, for example, the use of the scorecard, respond D. And finally, last but not least, respond E, if you believe that developing resources to help people consider transportation in housing decisions is the most important recommendation Houston can be working on. And just not to be a broken record, but one last time, because we have a few polls in a row now, as we're nearly finished with our formal presentation, and we'd like to open up for discussion in a few minutes. For those who have joined us in the interim, you can respond to the poll by going to pollev.com and entering the code JBROOKS, JBROOKS 762, or by text, by texting JBROOKS 762 to the number 22333. For those on the phone, it looks like, based on responses so far, that 47% or plus or minus of our webinar group, you all believe that preserving and building affordable housing near quality transportation is the single highest priority recommendation. Fairly close second, about 40% of individuals answering B, which is the opposite, to focus on increasing opportunities to walk, bike, and use transit near affordable housing. And then of the 3 tool-focused recommendations, really the practice change, the systems change ones there, D is popular at about 10% to use the decision maker scorecard. I also see that the Q&A and chat box are in use. That's excellent. We'll be getting to those momentarily. I'm going to go to the next slide for another poll question before we open up to comments. This is the same 5 answer choices, the same recommendations in the same order, A, B, C, D, and E. But now the question is, which recommendation are you personally most excited about helping with? There's not an option to mark you're not excited. So if you're not excited, I guess you can abstain or mark one that's the most exciting to you. Again, they're in the same order. The question is, which recommendation are you personally most excited about helping with? A, preserving and building affordable housing near transportation, or B, improving transportation near affordable housing, C, mapping and monitoring, both, D, prioritizing housing sites and improving access via walk, bike, transit using the scorecard, or E, developing resources for counseling. Again, I'll provide some time for everyone to respond, those who desire to. And to briefly describe responses so far, it looks like a little bit of a switch. The last slide, with the highest priority recommendation, again, this is as a researcher, I would say, and don't take this in an offensive way, a biased sample, because those of you who joined our webinar, it may be that we just inadvertently have more transportation people or more housing people. I do not know. But with the first question, the highest priority recommendation was A, to improve housing near transportation. But in this case, people seem to be most excited about helping with B, improving walk, bike, and transit near affordable housing, with about half. About a quarter of you think A, improving housing near transportation. And then quite a few people, about 13%, are interested in counseling and the counseling tools. Thank you for your responses and for your participation today. I don't take my tone as go hang up. We would like to discuss now what we related, but I want to take a moment to say that Houston stands at an inflection point, a point of change. While local governments now hold funding for housing recovery and affordable transportation improvements, more and more households are struggling, and the pandemic will only make this worse. A struggle to cover their basic expenses. We as stakeholders, as policymakers, as public, private, nonprofit stakeholders, and as individuals can all act better. Do more to connect housing and transportation, to improve housing in areas with transportation, and then conversely to improve transportation, both in strategic manners. Thank you for your time. We'll take some minutes now. It's 1:47. We've scheduled till 2:30, but we hope you're pleased that the formal presentation was not nearly that long. If some of my colleagues would unmute themselves and join in, Ani, Kyle. On the screen is our final poll. Aside from a one-word follow kind of feedback poll, the very last, where you can, as a respondent, respond online. Unfortunately, in this case, it's an open-ended question in some regards. I say unfortunately because we can't accept responses by text that are multi-word. The question is, please share any questions, comments, thoughts, or feedback. And you can respond online at polev.com by entering the code jbrooks762. As you make a comment, it'll come up anonymously, just the text. We ask that you, of course, please maintain appropriate language and content. It will appear on the screen. And if you're so inclined, you can see on your own device what comments have been put in, and you can rank and score those and move them up or down. But I will now cease talking and turn the time over to Ani and Kyle. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Ani Blair from Link Houston. We'll be moving into the question and answer period in just a second. First of all, thank you again to Jonathan Brooks with Link Houston, as well as John Park and Kyle Shelton with the Kinder Institute for the presentation. And again, thank you to our sponsors, the Cullen Foundation, for funding this research, as well as CivicCap Partners, Esperson, and Lovett In-Town Homes for sponsoring this event. To get to the questions and the hands raised, first, there are a number of questions that are referring to whether or not we did an overlay of this study with other overlapping and intersecting issues such as flooding, climate change, resilience, schools, crime, and race. I encourage you to first look at the report that will go out to all of the participants and will be available on the Link Houston website. It has more information, including addressing some of the historical segregation and historical housing segregation concerns that led to some of the disinvestment that we see here today. More specifically to the issue of overlays, this particular study looks specifically at housing and transportation. It does not overlay some of the other issues such as flooding and so forth. I will say that the Kinder Institute is going to produce a much larger study this summer on housing and the intersectionality with a number of other issues, including race and flooding. Kyle can speak more to that. So I encourage you to stay tuned for more information on housing with the Kinder Institute, and this study will comprise a small part of that larger study. Kyle, do you want to address more about the study you have coming up?
Sure, thanks, Ani. I'll flag two things. There's in later June, there is the inaugural State of Housing report that's coming out from the Kinder Institute. There's a similar webinar that will be posted for registration in the coming weeks here. And it is that report is a large data baseline of housing information for the county and the city and neighborhood levels. And it will touch on a lot of those overlapping challenges that Ani mentioned, in addition to transportation. And then the Kinder Institute is also, many of you probably know, the prime contractor and lead on the housing studies for both Harris County and the city of Houston. Those are longer term projects, but we are also grappling with many of those similar questions, and we'll be including those there.
Thanks, Kyle. There's also a question about implementation of recommendations that came before we got to the recommendation part. And I, again, direct your attention to the last three recommendations that specifically have tools for practitioners. These recommendations we went over very briefly, as Jonathan mentioned them. The mapping CATI tool was one. The scorecard was another that can specifically be used as when purchasing and identifying sites for future housing investments and repairing or improving facilities for housing investments. And then the last one on housing counseling tools, so tools that particularly housing counselors can use to facilitate their conversations. These are made for practitioners and are ways in which we are promoting moving these policy recommendations from general to a hands-on. So if you're interested in learning more about this presentation, having this presentation repeated for your organization, or specifically getting training on how to use any of those tools and adapting or adopting them to your organization, please email us at info@linkhouston.org and we'd be happy to set up a training session for you. I'm going to switch back and forth between the questions that we have coming in through the chat or Q&A box, as well as the hands raised. I know Sharon Moses Burnside from the Houston Department of Planning has had her hands raised for a while. Sharon, do you have a question for us you'd like to share? Sharon, we have you, I think you're muted still, and we're unmuting you, so you might have to unmute yourself again. There you go. Sharon, do you have a question? Okay, we can't hear Sharon. So Sharon, if you could email us your question and we'll address it. We'll go back to some of the questions we have in Q&A. There was a question about specifically the geographic scope. Jonathan, I'll turn to you to repeat some of the information about the geographic scope of this study, as well as the areas between the Beltway and Highway 6 on the north side have poor accessibility due to a pattern of lollipop development. This limits transit service, pedestrian and cycling, forcing all travel on major roadways. Jonathan, if you could address that.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So, and real quick while I have the microphone, that the slide is showing the top, looks like 10 or so comments, but we're capturing all of the others. And so if we're not able to get to your comment or question in the next half hour, we can start to publish maybe some FAQs or something on a website. To answer the question about geographic extent, this is always a challenge in the Houston region. We're a large region. The city of Houston itself actually has territory in 3 counties, primarily in Harris County. We primarily knew that our focus from the start was making sure we use the best available housing data. And that meant we largely focused on the city of Houston and census block groups that intersected it. And so much of the analysis, when you compare different data sets and one only has data for certain block groups, you end up with a limited view, but still useful. And so that's a part of the further explanation of the context. In regards to the question about the generalized speaking, in the areas in the north and northwest between Beltway 8 and Highway 6, FM 1960, there's quite a large supply of affordable housing dwellings units in those areas based on rent and reported units. Sometimes their development pattern is somewhat challenging to serve. And what you find, pardon me, in the Houston region is that there was a period of a few decades where development in general, regardless of who it was for, the type, did not tend to build sidewalk networks, and if they did build sidewalk networks, they're within the local neighborhood, not connecting the neighborhood to the larger streets to opportunities. And so there are pockets where there are sidewalks, perhaps, but they don't connect well to transit, and those areas are have less frequent transit service and are sometimes more challenging to serve. And so there are improvements being made in Metro Next. I see there's a question about Metro Next and the Houston Bike Plan. Many of our recommendations do point out some of the areas that in both those plans are slated to see improvements on the transportation side. And there's a need to really look at both sides of the coin, as I like to say.
Thank you, Jonathan. There are a couple of questions about how recommendation 2, that's specifically talking about preserving affordable housing, how that happens after the transit or bike or pedestrian infrastructure is actually invested. I will say in the report, it goes into more detail about needing policies to actually ensure that there aren't runaway costs, but I am going to ask Kyle to address that in a little bit more detail.
Sure, I was going to flag those questions as well. I think part of the challenge there, or a critical part of addressing that challenge, is sort of acknowledging that all of these things are interlaced, right? So investments in infrastructure absolutely can change the surrounding community and property values. And so that's where you also start to think about what are the strategies to preserve the existing housing stock and to ensure that long-term residents who want to choose to stay in that community have that opportunity. So that's things like not saying we're not going to invest because it could potentially lead to displacement, but instead asking the question of how do you do investments and other strategies, such as ensuring that subsidized units are protected for longer periods of time to make sure that families with lower incomes can stay there, how to ensure that new properties are brought there and have affordability requirements and other pieces there. So the recommendation certainly doesn't get into all of those pieces, but I think the short answer, because the long answer would take years of work and already is, right? And policy is to say that there have to be multiple approaches brought to the same areas where investments are being made in infrastructure to make sure that long-term residents can stay if they choose to.
Thank you, Kyle. There are also a couple of questions asking about how we viewed walking and biking in this context. As you'll note from the beginning, when we address definitions, we see walking and biking as just as important as transit itself, which forms the backbone of an affordable transportation network. So walking and biking are not just for recreation. We know that if you have a disability, you may be using your wheelchair, which is included in the pedestrian numbers. If you are walking to run errands, including right now, as we're all home under stay-at-home orders, we're running errands or doing small things by walking around our neighborhood, not just for recreation, but even without the COVID-19 times, walking and biking are just as important and are necessities that people use all the time for going to work, shopping, medical care, groceries, and anything else. They're also used to connect to transit. Jonathan, do you want to talk a little bit more again about how these are considered necessities or requirements and not just recreational transportation options?
Sure, I have a few comments on that. And this is common, that if you're fortunate to live on a street with a sidewalk, then it's more likely that you may choose to walk routinely, walk a dog, to get outside with your family or just to be outdoors, and to be able to do so safely. But it's another matter entirely to be able to really get places by walking and biking. And a few comments here: the Houston Parks Board, the City of Houston, Bike Houston, and other organizations and neighborhoods have been working for many years on improving bikeways and our bayous. For those outside our region, those are rivers or channels, water channels. And that's a network that can, by bike or walk, connect people at greater distance to opportunity. They connect generally to several of our employment centers. There's still a lot of work to be done there to connect those as a network into neighborhoods. It's also another matter that for people to be able to get from where they actually live to transit, and walking and biking are essential for that, because many people live a quarter mile, half mile from the transit stop they need to use if they're choosing to use transit. And the quality of their access to and from that can be very low or okay or to excellent. And part of that is there's a lot of historical reasons that our sidewalk network and our bikeway network are where they are now, meaning disparate, that there are locations where open drainage was the choice at point of development, and today it makes it really difficult to create sidewalks. But it also means that the roads are narrower and that people that do choose to walk are less safe. And so there's a lot of work to be done. The cities work to create safer streets, now embodied through Vision Zero, and some of the work that the region's doing, and the county's doing are drawing attention to this, that the Mayor Turner's Complete Communities initiative in certain neighborhoods has identified very specific community-based desires for improvements. There's a lot of work to be done, but the goal should be to make walking and biking really functional, to connect for shorter trips, half mile, but then to connect to transit, because transit is the longer distance backbone of the deeply affordable network.
Thank you, Jonathan. There's a question related to that on transportation that comes from the Harris County team, and it's about how transportation is just one part of this issue, but in greater Harris County or in the unincorporated areas, there's lack of access to jobs and other things. Jonathan and Kyle, would you like to address that question?
Pardon me, this is Jonathan Brooks again. I'm happy to jump in for a minute while maybe Kyle formulates some thoughts. In the study, we focused, as we've explained, on the city of Houston for various reasons, and that means that we focused on inside the metro service area, which does include much of unincorporated Harris County to the north and northwest and southwest. But the east side of Harris County itself, there are significant needs for deeply affordable housing and quality transportation. We are not unaware of that. Perhaps that's an opportunity for future analysis. There are some policy challenges underlying all of these things that at a state and federal level, in our case, perhaps especially at a state level, where unincorporated areas, it's challenging for them to join transit authorities to participate for higher levels of transit. And so Harris County Transit does provide services in some of those communities on the east side and across areas of Harris County where possible, but they have to operate under a different structure than Metro, and it has its own challenges. And I lost the rest of my thought. Kyle, if you could.
Yeah, sure, Jonathan. One thing I would add, it's a great point that transportation and housing alone are not the only factors that people are considering when they're making their housing choices, and that there are many areas where there are great opportunities that households are making the choice to locate near, and maybe balancing out some of their other need, like maybe they're accepting greater transportation costs or lack of access to existing transportation systems in exchange for something, right? And certainly households make different calculations based on what their needs are and what their priorities are. But I think one of the things that this work highlights is that there are many areas where, for example, there's a good amount of relatively affordable housing in existence that isn't connected to transportation. And so I think part of the answer to this really important line of thinking is it is important to improve those connections and bring transportation to those areas so that more people can take that opportunity, because not everybody can kind of make that trade-off. And ideally, it would give people access to even greater areas of opportunities and connect them back to other places. So if they're making a choice about, their household schooling needs and are living in a place that's maybe further out, or affordability on housing, it doesn't mean that they don't ever have the chance to access other things if we're able to improve transportation and connect them in other ways. But it's absolutely, these are two factors of multiple things that are going into people's housing choices.
This is Jonathan again. If I may jump back in, that's why, thank you, Kyle. That's why the counseling tools that were developed, the task force, don't say you must consider transportation. It must be your second priority after housing. Rather, it's to say that when an individual, for example, is in a introductory workshop with a counseling institution, thinking about trying to figure out how to get into a home or to find new housing, they may want to consider transportation. And so it's a resource to help them choose to electively consider that. But that's not to say it's not, as Kyle adeptly described, it's probably something they probably don't think about. And the Kinder Institute's blog post today talks about this a little more, that because we pay transportation in pieces, in small amounts here and there, sometimes a monthly payment that's substantial, but it doesn't seem like it's adding up to as much as it does. Whereas the average Houston household right now spends about 25% of their income on transportation. That's all households of all income levels, 25%. So it's under 30% on average, but the lower income households spend more. But 22% of income spent on transportation, and that is high. And so, but that's not to say it outweighs perhaps schools and proximity to family and friends and social network. But we wanted to create tools that would help people start to consider transportation if they want to.
Thank you. I'm going to jump around just a little bit. There is a question about whether the City of Houston or Houston Housing Authority use transportation as a factor in their decision-making currently, the answer is yes. Transportation is used in decision-making currently, but in a fashion in which we would like to see it expanded and used in a more nuanced way. Hence, some of the recommendations, particularly the practitioner tools at the end. Oftentimes, and this is not specific to any local entity, but in many cases across the country, transportation is used as a factor in federal grants as well as local state grants, but it's often something such as, is there a transit stop period that may be within a half mile? It doesn't think more beyond that sometimes about the frequency of that transportation, or if there's a sidewalk, for instance, to be able to actually reach public transit. So if you are a person with a disability or a person who has mobility issues or even a teenager or a child, you're going to want to be able to reach that transportation option, which is not necessarily considered in a more detailed fashion in existing efforts to incorporate transportation into the decision making. With that, I am going to turn back to Kyle to address whether the housing and transportation considerations are part of the 9% housing tax credit opportunity.
So I don't at the moment know the full set of elements that are into the 9% right now. I know that those types of topics are often considered in the broader scorecard, but I can't tell you exactly sort of what value is assigned to different pieces. I do know, for example, and this is broader than the 9% tax credit, as Ani mentioned around the city and the housing authority, those entities often will add elements to requests for proposals around particular programs where they will say something like additional, I'm making this overall number up, but out of 100 points, project proposals that are within X proximity of a high frequency transit line, or out of the floodplain, to an earlier question, there are ways to add in requirements to people who are responding to proposals for funding. And that often gets incorporated, and the 9% tax credit and other programs like it are able to include elements like that. As I said, I don't know for sure right now if that's a state run and state mandated process. And I don't know if transportation is currently included in it, but it is often included in other housing programs.
While we're talking about housing, I want to address some of these other housing questions. So there's a question specifically about differentiating between recommendation number 4 and recommendation number 1. Recommendation number 1 being a policy-focused recommendation and recommendation around housing, and recommendation number 4 specifically referring to the scorecard, which is a tool that can be used to cite housing. Jonathan and then Kyle, can you talk a little bit more about the difference between that policy recommendation and the tool recommendation?
Yes, it's an excellent question. You could possibly collapse them into the same, but you might lose some of the nuance of both. And I would say that recommendation 1 is more looking at the broader system and at the highest levels, and the near, medium, long-term kind of planning processes and policy implications. What do we need to be doing to ensure that we're putting housing and selecting housing for improvement and rehabilitation or new housing in context of transportation? And so we separated that out intentionally as a very high priority, but policy and future investment focused recommendation, whereas the scorecard is, and its attendant recommendation that is broader even than the scorecard, is about changing day-to-day practice now, and does not necessarily need to be just at government or at pseudo-government levels. Rather, it's a scorecard that can be used, for example, through the workforce, the task force. We had several members who are community leaders in some regard in their areas, and they found the process very interesting and valuable, and this final scorecard, because it can be a tool. In that case, the recommendation is about a tool and a practice that can be used by many different people. And for example, community leaders could use a scorecard to understand what they should be seeking on behalf of their community in community benefits agreements with developers and government and other stakeholders. And so it has some broader implications. And so we tailor the recommendations that way.
And I would just add again that the recommendation one is it includes a slew of potential options, right? And again, it's everything from preserving existing units, whether that's through nonprofits or mission-driven for-profits, protecting existing naturally occurring affordable housing. Those are units that are often the first to be lost in in neighborhoods that are quickly undergoing change and redevelopment. And so ensuring that those types of homes and apartments can be preserved and maintained at a if not the same level of affordability or improved level of affordability, at least at a level that's still attainable for most families in the region. And I would say in a lot of ways, the scorecard one also dovetails nicely with recommendation number one, in that it should be informing it could potentially inform a lot of the decisions that are being made, right? To ensure, like, if we're building a new affordable housing structure, using the scorecard to say, is it accessible to transit? Does it meet these other needs is really critical. And the last piece I would add is recommendation number one is really a call to make sure we're leveraging these massive investments, right? There are very few investments that are made publicly that collectively are more money than infrastructure, and ensuring that those infrastructure investments are tied to and supporting safe and affordable homes for residents is a really critical piece to do.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions about the tools and data sets that were used to develop this report and the tools. One question specifically refers to the Center for Neighborhood Technology and their housing plus transportation methodology. I want to mention first and foremost that we are very much aware of this great tool and reference it repeatedly, both in the body of the report, which you can find online, as well as a reference point within the scorecard for practitioners to use as they're finding and improving sites for affordable housing. I will also say that in our original plans for an event, the original event had several panelists, and one of them included Scott Bernstein, who is the founder of the Center for Neighborhood Technology and the developer of that H+T Affordability Index. So we have worked closely with that information and built on it to adapt it for now and specifically for the Houston region. Jonathan, do you want to talk a little bit more about the differentiating between the tools and how this is applied to Houston?
Yes, and this is Jonathan again, and I'll do so by describing the first workshop activity in November with the task force. Imagine you're in a room with some people you know, some people you don't know. It was in a location that was easily accessible by transit, both local bus and rail, relatively good sidewalks, and there was food provided. There were no barriers to participation, but you're at a table with some, we intentionally mixed people up a little bit, a table of four, groups of four, and the activity is to describe for your table group how you arrived at the meeting, regardless, total non-judgment, safe space. Describe how you arrived there and why you traveled the way you did, what you felt about it. And the next person would relate back to you what they heard you say, the facts. And the next person at your table would then say, well, this is how I think you felt about it. And the fourth person responds back to you, to the group, to summarize what they saw as the underlying values that motivated you to travel the way you did, however it was. And we did that activity where every single person, all four people, took turns doing that at each table. And that was the basis for the scorecard, because the underlying values, we identified more than 60 value words that were part of the quality experience of someone traveling somewhere in Houston. And those values were, over a process of several months, grouped into a few headings. And so when you go open the scorecard, you'll see the values themselves and a goal that we all came up with to summarize it. And the questions in the scorecard are centered on those, because what we're trying to really do is to make sure that someone who wants to or needs to or chooses to walk, bike, and use transit, they can do so with dignity and safety, and because they want to be friendly to the environment, and because they don't feel comfortable driving, or they can't afford to, they have a disability. And that's the scorecard is much broader than simply how many jobs can you get to in 30 minutes, or there's a bus route within a quarter mile. We don't know if there's a sidewalk or a crosswalk, or there's a pedestrian signal, that the curb cut ramps at the corners are actually accessible and not covered with mud and broken glass. So the scorecard delves into that, and it's a product of the process. And so it may at first surprise some people as, well, it's really quite long, but they're simple yes or no's. It's a voluntary tool in our view, and can really help someone see things from an individual's perspective, the end user. And that is the scorecard. The counseling tools we've talked about a little bit more. They're fairly straightforward. In fact, the individual workbook references some of those same types of questions on the scorecard because the counselors found them very interesting as part of the workshops, as the 2 workshop series interacted with each other. And so that's the nature of the tools, and the underlying data for the geographic analysis, the housing, the number of dwellings per census block group and density, the median gross rent, and the 7 indicators in the transportation index. Those are all available publicly. Link Houston's website, if you scroll to the bottom of the web page on our site where the report is, there's a link to the data set, and you can export all the GIS data that we used and export on a map. But that's the tools we decided were important, not just to import from another region, because we really wanted to, as a task force, create something that was holistic, and we could not find, we did a very exhaustive literature scan of practice nationally, and we found some examples for pieces, but nothing that brought them all together.
Thank you. There are a number of questions that ask about best practices from other cities for aligning this research. And I want to emphasize what Jonathan just mentioned. This research does not specifically reinvent what others have done, and particularly the H+T affordability index. It doesn't create a new index for affordability specifically. It looks at the overlay for where these things are and where investments can go, and also presents these tools that practitioners can use, from the mapping tool that's specific to Houston, to the scorecard, to the counseling tools. Kyle, can you talk about some best practices from other cities, either in the housing space, the transportation space, and particularly in alignment?
Yeah, so there's a couple of examples that I would highlight. There are a number of cities who have tried to, as we talked about in the previous question, I'll connect transportation investments and housing investments. So the city of Denver, for example, has a housing trust fund that is particularly aimed at preserving affordable homes or building affordable projects in and around key transit nodes. So not, for an example of that is not allowing a naturally occurring affordable housing property right next to a critical station or a critical connection point to be torn down and turned into retail or some other, or just simply more higher end housing. That is a tool that Denver and other cities have emulated. Denver has used and other cities have emulated. And then I think another kind of just broad municipal level action that many cities take is to really prioritize within either their zoning codes or in just their building and development ordinances, prioritize coming up with what are the right typologies and right incentives and right regulations, limits for development on key transit corridors and other places. Houston has had various iterations of that in the past, and they're currently working right now on the Walkable Places Committee and updating some of those regulations to think about that. So that I think that's encouraging, and we have an opportunity to think about what are the types of development we want to see along sort of key corridors that we're identifying as places that should have a focal point of more housing investment to take advantage of those transit investments. But again, those all need to continue to be tempered with other programs that support folks who are long-term residents if they choose to stay in those neighborhoods. And again, I've already named some of those, but some other examples are things like having property tax abatements for elder residents or a range of other categories of folks who you want to help keep in their existing homes, increasing subsidized units so folks can stay in neighborhoods where values might be changing, and continue to access those infrastructures that are improving the community and connecting it better. So there's a range, and different cities, both in the United States and across the country or across the world are working to combine them. So there's a lot of different examples.
Thank you. There are a few comments also about the intersection of these two issues. One comment from the Q&A line says maybe the interest in working on transportation, meaning from the poll, the more people wanting to work on transportation is because it's politically easier to propose transportation projects, which can be race neutral as opposed to housing projects or efforts because they are associated with racially specific neighborhoods. I throw that out in case anyone wants to have more comment on that. And there's also a comment from our friends at TEI who are working on the Houston bike plan implementation that remind us that they are going to be updating some of the trails and bikeways that are online with their GIS later, so we can see how even more of these communities that are already places of affordable housing have new opportunities to connect with the bikeways. So they may be housed and increasingly connected in terms of what the terminology the study has used. There's a question on B-cycle, and specifically if access to public transit is determined by proximity to transit stops, should B-cycle access be something that should be factored? Jonathan?
We did, that's an astute question. This is Jonathan Brooks. We did investigate that as a metric. Our concern was that we did want to have more than one bike focused metric in the quality affordable transportation index. That we decided the trouble was that the stations are fairly concentrated geographically, even more so than high comfort bikeways, meaning protected bikeways. And so we thought it might inadvertently skew the index a little more than the other 7 indicators, which are more widely applicable. And so at one point it was in our model, but we decided that after some testing that it did not really substantially change the story, but it was something that we felt would be a little more difficult to explain. And so we wanted to keep the conversation more applicable more broadly. And so that's a candid answer where we value the bike share. I mean, I have a bikes B-cycle membership, and but that was part of our thinking. I don't know if John Park, that was a conversation we had back in the fall when we were thinking through this.
Yeah, I guess the data-wise, the bike facility is quite limited into a certain geography, so we didn't want to. We wanted to have more like a comprehensive and broad concept of bike indicators. So I think that's why we ended up not using that indicator.
Okay, we have just a few more minutes and a couple more questions. I'll try to summarize some of these. There is a question about COVID-19 response, and I know that this is something we've talked a lot about the future of transportation and the impacts on housing. Kyle, do you want to take that question first? What are your thoughts about the impact of COVID-19? You addressed this a little bit in your opening.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is yet to be determined, right? But certainly thinking through how both housing and transportation may change in response to that is a very good point. I think in general, it will take some time to see if there are durable shifts in how people are moving. I think part of what most of the folks on this call are cognizant of in Houston is that the majority of our infrastructure has been built for cars. So I don't think there's an overarching transformation, on day 1 or day 27 or day 100 of the transition back from COVID, but I do think folks certainly will start to evaluate some of their transportation choices. In the same way, I think that the need for housing affordability is going to become even more pressing. And I failed to mention this when I was in the formal presentation, but the numbers we showed about housing are from previous years of the census, right? So they don't reflect the post-COVID situation, and those are only going to get worse, and the indicators are only going to get worse, as I mentioned, because folks are losing income and are feeling pinched from a variety of other costs, whether it's actually dealing with health challenges or just the new realities of their households. And so the need for affordable housing and a variety of types of that housing in all parts of the city and region is going to continue to be critical. But in terms of how, I think the transportation one is far more flexible in some ways. And how people respond to that, I think, ranges everywhere from the institutional response of a group like Metro, an agency like Metro, and an agency like HGAC about investments and how we're building a system, down to the personal choices that folks are making.
Okay, there are a couple of other questions, and we're not going to have time for all of them, but I do direct you one more time, Jonathan, if you could go to the page where the link exists. If you check out linkhouston.org, or just go there, you can follow this specific link. You can find all of the resources, including the tools that were mentioned, the scorecard, the counseling tools, and the data and mapping tools available there, as well as all of the recommendations. These recommendations do include information more about why we need a citywide campaign, not just the household counseling tools at the micro level to address NIMBYism and other things. I know that was another question. And finally, again, thank you to the researchers, to the Kinder Institute, to the team at Link Houston, and especially to the Cullen Foundation for funding this research, as well as Esperson, Civicap Partners, and Lovett in Townhomes for sponsoring this webinar today. Thank you to all of our participants, and we hope that you'll reach out to us for training on any of these tools or to have more information on the study. And as you're exiting, we would love feedback. So in lieu of a survey right now, you can provide feedback on what you thought about this presentation as the last question in the poll. So you can enter it online or through the text that you've been using. So how are you feeling as a result of this meeting today? Thank you, everybody.